Good evening, friends. I was going to propose if I do this again that I have Paula doing my writing and Oscar doing my visuals. But that's next time. So this year marks my 10th anniversary at QUNO. And as happens with elderly people, I'm also 60 this year. I know that's young for some of you. So I've been pulling out some old photographs, and I thought I'd share this one with you. So this is from a visit of US peace activists to China in 2008, led by the American Foreign Service Committee. The picture is taken on the Great Wall, and the gentleman that you can't see holding the "war is not the answer" sign is Joe Volk, former head of FCNL, who impressed me enormously with his ability to stay on message. We'd gotten to this point after several hours of walking on a hot day north of Beijing, and he just pulls out this sign out of his pocket. And who travels around China prepared for every photo op? But apparently, if you're the head of FCNL, you do that. So I think you learn from everyone. And then the fresh-faced young man in the middle, in front of Kevin Martin from Peace Action, is me. 10 years later, this photo was taken last week. This is what 10 years can do to you, my friends. So this was a meeting at the UN on peacebuilding and human rights that QUNO co-hosted and facilitated. On my right is Florence from QUNO Geneva, who is presenting. On my left are the Swiss and then the German ambassadors. And on the screen is the Guatemalan ambassador. As you see, he's in deep thought just prior to finding the right words to answer the Russian representative who has just made a not very constructive statement about human rights. But the story I want to talk about today starts earlier, in 2001. Now, in the fall of that year, I was living in Montclair, New Jersey with my family. It's a green suburb 15 miles from Manhattan. We had a nice house in a safe neighborhood. The kids were in a good public school system. I was commuting into New York City every day for work, and Ursula, my wife, had recently finished her graduate study in nursing. Like any young family, we had challenges. Things weren't perfect, but generally things felt as if they were heading in the right direction. And then came September. The office where I was working was a few blocks north of the World Trade Center. I was situated on a trading floor with many big TV screens. So as the news started to filter through of an airplane flying into the first tower, we were seeing everything as it was being reported. I remember a colleague crying out as she realized that her husband was on one of the floors where the plane had hit and being helped away by colleagues. Seeing it on TV felt very unreal, even though everything was happening so close. After a couple of hours, we were evacuated from the building right onto West Street. The wind was blowing from the north, and it was a bright, sunny fall day. So we had a clear view of one of the towers. We could see objects falling from the upper floors of the burning building. And then someone gasped when they realized that those objects were people jumping. It took most of the day to get back home. The tunnels and trains weren't operating, so we had to line up for hours to get a ferry across the Hudson. The neighborhood was in shock. Lots of people commuted into the city, so everyone was affected. My daughter's friend's father died. Our next door neighbor, who was a fireman, was called in and came back very quiet. But the neighborhood pulled together. Nobody ate dinner alone for a while. After a week, we returned to the office, well before they were letting most people back. So I'd take the train and show my pass to get through the security barricades on Canal Street, and walked through empty streets to get to work. A short distance away, the piles of rubble were still smouldering. What I remember most from those days was the smell, an acrid, metallic, unpleasant smell that seemed to get everywhere, that didn't completely wash off, even after a long shower. Looking back, so many things changed after that. I never felt quite at home in the banking world. Someone once told me that if you're going to swim with sharks, you will either need to become a shark or get out. But now I felt an additional distance. And as a Quaker, and someone who had traveled quite a bit, including in the Middle East, I was uncomfortable with the response of the US and other governments, the attacks there on Afghanistan and Iraq, and the rise of intolerance and hate. So the months went on with a continuing sense of dislocation. And then the following summer, I got 2 additional pieces of news. First, confirming some health concerns I'd had for a while. My doctors gave me a definitive diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which is the reason for the cane that I use. Now, without going into details, as many of you know, the general direction of MS is gradually increasing disability, although the course of the condition is different for everyone. And then a few months after that, I was laid off, as the bank I was working for let go a large number of staff in the financial uncertainty that followed the World Trade Center attacks of the previous year. So by the end of 2002, my world had changed completely. Already feeling unsettled, I was now trying to get my mind around being unemployed and with a life-changing medical diagnosis. I didn't fit into my own picture of myself anymore. I didn't know how to think about myself or about my relationships with everyone around me. Some of you perhaps have had a bad year. That was a bad year. But 5 long years later, after a lot of pain, a great deal of honest reflection, and a tremendous amount of support from my friends and family and my meeting, I found myself representing Quakers at the United Nations in New York. And this story is about those years, and particularly how what I learned over that time and after that prepared and reshaped me and has made me fit, at least on a good day, for the work I've been lucky enough to be doing for friends ever since. The first area I wanted to reflect on is the role of personal transformation, the power of inward-looking examination and reflection, of individual leadings, and the importance of direct experience. This slide is of the coffee table in front of one of the cellars at Quaker House. I've been at Quaker since my mid-20s when I first came to the US on a graduate exchange program. And so when all this happened, I started to pray a lot. And in particular, I prayed for clarity to help me know and understand what I should do and the strength to do it. Because at least in my experience, one of the hardest things about praying for guidance is what to do if you actually get it. You know, I imagine many of you have had a similar experience. You're trying to work out what to do, so you pray for some help and some good advice. And you pray some more, and wonder if anyone's listening. And then sometimes you do get a pretty clear reply. But the message you're getting isn't quite what you want to hear. In fact, in my experience, the answers that come in prayer tend to be really challenging and make me feel pretty uncomfortable. So then I procrastinate, or I try to ask lots of clarifying questions, or I second guess myself. And so it was in this case. I needed a job. And looking back, I can see how my job search gradually changed, with persistent prayerful nudging going on in the background, shifting slowly from trying to get back into banking to eventually looking for something where the main focus would be directly trying to bring about change in the world in line with what I believed. And finally, and perhaps when at long last I was actually ready for it, I saw by chance the ad for a position at the Quaker UN Office with submissions due the following day. So I stayed up most of the night to rewrite my cover letter and my resume, and 6 months later, I started my new job. Now, the UN Charter was signed in 1945 in San Francisco, and the Quaker offices of the UN were founded in 47, the same year as Quakers in Britain and the US were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of friends everywhere. And this slide is the prize certificate for the Friends Service Council. And then it was, of course, just as the first wave of diplomats and international civil servants were arriving in New York to be at the birth of this extraordinary new institution on which so many of the hopes of a world tired of war and desperate for peace depended. And for over 70 years, Quaker UN representatives in New York and Geneva have worked alongside those diplomats and UN officials to bring friends, insights, and perspectives on a wide range of peace and justice issues. In New York, which is under the care of AFSC and the Friends World Committee for Consultation, we have an office of just 6 people working every day with policymakers, listening, facilitating, advocating quietly. And we're fortunate to have at the heart of our work Quaker House, a brownstone on 48th Street in the middle of the UN district, which provides a unique setting for informal and off-the-record meetings with delegates and officials. The work is largely behind the scenes, but occasionally glimpses of its impact are made public, as in 2013, when the QUNO offices were named to a list of the most influential global actors in the reduction of armed violence. Coming into the UN job was a direct result for me of powerful personal experience and spiritual reflection. And I soon realized that at the UN, it was important to maintain this connection with individual motivation, not only for myself, but also to support it in others, including those we worked with within the UN system. I remember when I first arrived at the UN, there was a welcoming tea at Quaker House, and I had the cheek to open my remarks by reading the Preamble to the UN Charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to practice tolerance, and to live together in peace with one another, have resolved to combine our efforts to establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. I realized as I looked around the room that a number of the UN guests had their eyes closed. Not, I think, because they were napping, because normally it takes at least 10 minutes to fall asleep when I'm talking. We're about that far into this. But I think their eyes were closed because for them, the Charter was almost a religious document, and that they too were there to bring about a better world. I've not forgotten that. And for me, it remains an important reminder that reaching out to the individual human and spiritual being is critical. Changing minds in any environment is also about changing hearts, about connecting to individual hopes and fears. People want and need to be heard and engaged. They want to be treated with respect. And that's how you move to agreement and to consensus. The personal is also important even when trying to make high-level policy change. The United Nations recently adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 17 Sustainable Development Goals, incorporating 169 targets for wiping out poverty, eliminating inequality, promoting sustainability, building peaceful and inclusive societies, and tackling climate change. For 4 years, QUNO worked to ensure that the goal of promoting peaceful and inclusive societies was included in the final version, in particular in what became Goal 16, the Peace Goal. And an approach that we used consistently was to appeal to basic human experience, that violence is a fundamental dimension of human suffering, as much part of the lives of the poorest as poverty and hunger. Connecting to both fundamental values and direct experience, this framing cut through much of the political noise around the peace issues and had the effect of changing the discussion from whether peace would be included to how it should be addressed. The second area I wanted to reflect on is the role of the group insight and corporate discernment in the quest for truth and right action. Going back to my own story, in those 5 years, I became a lot more active in my Chatham Summit meeting in New Jersey, on various committees, and then as assistant clerk and then clerk. I should say this is a picture I pulled off the internet. I'm not actually sure where it's from. If you're in it, let me know afterwards. So among other things, this was a time when my meeting was grappling with a variety of challenges, including a lengthy and sometimes painful discernment around committed relationships and same-sex marriage. And so while I was on the one hand doing a lot of reading around Quakerism, I was also getting a crash course in Quaker spiritual and business practice. And while I learned a great deal from struggling with personal challenges that then informed my work at QUNO, I also learned a tremendous amount from the quite different challenges of being meeting clerk and seeking to accompany the spiritual journey of the meeting as a whole, and looking for practical ways to support and protect the health and integrity of the group as a spiritual practice, as important as the individual journeys that we were all making in our own different ways. It was also clear that in both of these areas, individual transformation and group discernment, that they have deep roots in Quaker practice and thought. Thus, Margaret Fell, quoting George Fox and emphasizing the search for individual integrity and knowledge. Then what had any to do with the scriptures, but they came forth to the Spirit that gave them light? You will say Christ said this and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? And Howard Brinton, several hundred years later, on the different power of corporate discernment. Since there is but one light and one truth, if the light of truth be faithfully followed, unity will result. The nearer the members of a group come to this one light, the nearer they will be to one another, just as the spokes of a wheel approach one another as they near the center. In my experience, an immediate link to the corporate practice of the meeting for worship that was directly transferable to the work at QUNO was the importance of creating and protecting safe and transformative spaces, and then using them not only to build bridges, but to make progress where discussions seem stuck. For example, my colleagues in Geneva worked for 2 years with negotiators around the process that led up to the recent Paris Agreement on climate change. Their primary program tool was to arrange a series of small dinners, quiet conversations with delegates, these are actually the delegates doing the negotiations, selected from across the range of negotiating blocs. They structured each dinner so as to emphasize the common ground between the delegates, basing each gathering around a small number of questions. These could be as simple as, what kind of a future would you like for your grandchildren? By creating and maintaining a protected space, and this slide is of the living room at Quaker House in New York set up for a meeting, finding ways to connect with each individual, and then nudging the group towards what in religious terms we might call group discernment. It was possible to open up new ways forward that perhaps no one had come into the room with. For me, this also illustrates another important issue for social action rooted in Quaker practice, which is that you don't need to have all the answers to get engaged or to foster change. While one model of advocacy can be to make up your own mind on an issue and then try to persuade others that you're right and they're wrong, another equally valid Quaker model is to bring people together and to create a space where the group can try to discern a new way forward. And this connects with what Quakers know from the spiritual practice of the gathered meeting, that the truth is something to be aspired to together, but perhaps always unknowable. That we must always try to get as close as we can, and yet have the humility to acknowledge that there is more yet to know. And our current perspective is simply the best that we have come up with so far, according to our measure of the light. So to conclude, soon after I joined QUNO, I found myself working with my colleagues and members of the Quaker UN Committee, which includes Quakers from all around the world, on an extensive planning exercise. With 4,000 or so organizations with some kind of relationship with the United Nations, what, if anything, was special or different about the Quaker UN Office? And it was in mulling over these issues and the ones we've discussed today, in thinking about the role of personal transformation and group insight, and in listening deeply to the experience of other friends, and thinking about 350 years of Quakers in the world, that it became clear to us that the things that Quakers do well in social action actually have their roots in Quaker spiritual practice. And that the fruits of that practice and the qualities of insight, fellow feeling, groundedness, integrity, inclusivity, hope, and love are the same things that have characterized Friends' unique contribution over hundreds of years. Above all, these things particularly connect through the way in which we do this work. That working methods are just as important as programmatic objectives, the how as important as the what, and that the means are indeed the ends in the making. For in the final analysis, if we are to effectively advocate for peace, justice, and inclusion, then it is incumbent upon us to act peacefully, justly, and inclusively ourselves. Thank you.